Oh, these bloody heat waves, man. Make everything so hot. Not like the kitchen, though. The kitchen crazy hot. There are some films you watch and enjoy, and then there are some films where you think they're specifically made for you. Tony is one of those films. Directed by Matt Johnson and starring Dominic Sessa as a young Anthony Bourdain, Tony takes us back to 1975, when Bourdain is just 19 years old. Rather than trying to tell the entire story of his life, this film focuses on a small but a very important period in his early adulthood, as he begins to figure out who he is, what he wants to do, and where food fits into his life. And I absolutely fucking loved this film. I should probably explain why Anthony Bourdain means so much to me before I get into the film itself. Before I got into filmmaking, I used to study as a chef, and during that time, I discovered Anthony Bourdain. His way of talking about food, cooking, and travelling completely changed the way I looked at things. I discovered Anthony Bourdain, and the way he talks about cooking, travelling, completely changed the way I looked at all these things. Food wasn't just about cooking something and putting it on a plate. It becomes more a way of experiencing different cultures and meeting different people, and travelling became something I want to do much more because of Anthony Bourdain and watching his shows. So when I heard that Matt Johnson was making a film about Bourdain, I was immediately interested. But I think what surprised me the most about Tony isn't that it didn't really feel like a traditional biopic. It wasn't trying to give us the greatest hits of Anthony Bourdain's life. We don't get the famous chef. We don't get the television personality. We don't even get the man who would eventually travel the world and become one of the most recognizable food writers and presenters of this generation. Instead, we get a 19-year-old who is immature, selfish, manipulative, insecure, and at times just an idiot. And I think that's exactly what makes this film work, because Anthony Bourdain wasn't born knowing who he wanted to be. He's just a young guy trying to figure his shit out, and that is surprisingly very relatable. One of the things I kept coming back to throughout the film was his relationship with Nancy. Anthony just keeps lying to her over and over again, and there were moments where I genuinely wanted him to tell her the truth, but at the same time I found myself rooting for him. And I think that's because the film understands that Anthony isn't necessarily lying because he's a horrible person. He's lying because he doesn't really know how to confront the truth himself. He doesn't really know who he is yet. And that becomes really important at the end of the film, because I think Tony is ultimately about a boy becoming a man. I think that's the true meaning of the film. Not in some strange, huge way, but just much smaller way, as Anthony starts to slowly understand what he actually wants from his life, and that begins with food. There's this montage in the film that I absolutely loved, where Anthony is introduced to the real world of cooking. He's taken on the boats, he's shown how to cook on the beach, he's taught how to cook, and you can see something click inside him. This isn't just Anthony learning how to become a chef, but this is Anthony discovering what he's actually passionate about. And having trained as a chef myself, that is probably one of my favourite parts of the entire film, is discovering that passion for food and cooking food, because there's something working in a kitchen that is difficult to explain unless you've experienced it, because sometimes it's chaotic, it's exhausting, it's stressful, and it can be completely fucking miserable. But there's also something incredibly satisfying about learning how everything works. And I think the film captures that absolutely spot on and beautifully, really well done. Anthony starts off as this directionless young man, and gradually, food gives him something to care about. And I think that's why the film's more slice of life approach works so well. Tony doesn't feel like it's constantly trying to tell us, look, this is the moment Anthony Bourdain became Anthony Bourdain. Instead, it lets these moments happen. And that's also why I think Matt Johnson's direction is particularly strong. The film feels incredibly naturalistic. The camera doesn't constantly scream for your attention. The shots feel like they have a purpose, and there's a very little that feels unnecessary. But at the same time, the film can suddenly become almost surreal. The use of fire, sunsets, and warm images give the film this strange, dreamlike quality, while everything around them still feels incredibly grounded. And I really like that contrast, because Anthony's life at this point is grounded and messy, but we're watching the beginning of something that will eventually become extraordinary. And Dominic Sessa as Tony was fucking brilliant. He done such an incredible job. He doesn't just play Bourdain as some perfect young genius who is destined to become famous. He plays him as a kid. A flawed, immature, sometimes frustrating kid who doesn't really know what he's doing. And I think that's so much more interesting than just learning about Anthony Bourdain when he became famous or when he was travelling. There's something really impressive about watching a performance of someone we already know so well, but seeing them before the person that we recognise. Because we know where Anthony Bourdain is going. We know the chef that he is going to become. And we know the writer that he's going to become. And we know the traveller that he's going to become. And because of that, there's this strange feeling throughout the film that we're watching someone discover a future that we know already exists. And that makes the ending hit even harder, in my opinion. By the end, Anthony finally admits the real reason he went to Provincetown. He's finally honest. His mother is proud of him, and he makes the decision to pursue cooking and attend the Culinary Institute of America. It's a relatively small ending, as there's no massive Hollywood moment, and I think that's why I loved it the most. Because the film isn't saying, this is where Anthony Bourdain became a legend. It's saying, this is where Anthony finally figured out what he wanted to do. And knowing what eventually happens to Anthony Bourdain gives this ending another layer. It's difficult to not think about the man we know when we're watching this young version of him, and that makes the film sadder. But I don't think Tony is trying to make us feel sad about what's coming. If anything, I think it's asking us to appreciate the person before the legend, before the books, before the television show, before the travelling, before everyone even knew his name, just Anthony. A 19-year-old who hasn't figured out his life yet, and maybe that's why this film connected with me so much as it did. Because I didn't discover Anthony Bourdain when he was 19 years old. I don't think most people discovered Anthony Bourdain when he was 19 years old. Not until his later years in life. I discovered him later, when he had already become this incredibly accomplished chef, writer, and traveller, as most people probably did. But Tony reminded me that he wasn't always the same person. He had to figure it out too. And I believe that's something that a lot of us can relate to. Not just Tony, not just me, but a lot of people. We're all trying to figure out what we're supposed to be doing with our lives. Sometimes you find it immediately. Sometimes you spend years fucking about trying to figure out what you want to do. And for Anthony, that was food. And for me, that was food for a time as well. Discovering Anthony Bourdain while I was training as a cook helped me realize how much I wanted to experience the world outside of the kitchen. And now I'm trying to figure out what filmmaking means to me. So maybe that's why I connected with Tony so much. It's a film about someone discovering something that gives their life direction. And honestly, I think Matt Johnson has made something really special here. Since it's funny, it's messy, uncomfortable, doesn't try to turn Anthony Bourdain into some saint. It just shows him as a young man trying to figure himself out. And I think that makes it a much more interesting story than simply watching a legend become a legend. So to reiterate, I absolutely fucking love Tony. It was a brilliant film. And if you're a fan of Anthony Bourdain, I think there's something really special about seeing this side of him. But even if you don't know much about Anthony Bourdain, I think the film works well on its own anyway, because ultimately it's not really about becoming famous. It's about finding something you care about, and sometimes that's all you really need to start figuring out who you really are. Thanks for watching, and give me your opinions in the comments if you have any.